Hello everybody and welcome to Grey History, episode 87, Total War. Assailed on every front and betrayed by those within, the French Republic was on the precipice of collapse. Only a revolution in the very nature of warfare could save it. Only total war. In this episode, we're going to discuss the unprecedented use of conscription and propaganda. Next episode, we'll explore the revolutionary changes to the officer corps and tactics, and taken together, we'll see a new era of warfare, one in which the Republic strikes back. But before we get into it, I need your help to stay in the fight. It's only community members that keep this podcast on the air, so if you're enjoying the show, please support the podcast for a coffee or two a month. Enjoy all the amazing perks and create history that isn't black and white by sponsoring Grey History today at patreon.com. As always, a special thank you to every community member and a shout out to the great of the greats, the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R, Scott, Howard, Gilberto, Ron, Kevin S and Fernando. And with that, let's get into it. When I was younger, I used to play a computer game called Total War. The concept was simple. Stare at a pretty map, march around your armies, and slowly but surely crush your enemies into oblivion. Now, as with all historical games, the series did have its inaccuracies. Nonetheless, it did a fairly good job of representing reality, as well as my underutilized skills as a military genius. But one matter in which the gameplay did deviate from history is reflected in the game's title, Total War. Although video games often encourage players to wage the grandest of campaigns, in reality, war is often anything but total. To understand what I mean by total and limited war, let me offer you two stark examples. To borrow from historian David Bell, total war can be defined as a war involving the complete mobilization of a society's resources to achieve the absolute destruction of an enemy. Furthermore, in achieving this unmitigated victory, all distinction is erased between combatants and non-combatants, while even controversial or illegal means may be seen as legitimate. The World Wars provide the best illustrations. Mass conscription and the transformation of the home front combined with economic controls and rationing to harness every resource available. Moreover, expanded powers to increasingly centralized governments allowed this to occur, along with coordinated propaganda campaigns and restrictions on civil liberties which were once deemed unthinkable. Additionally, while individual freedoms were heavily curtailed, the rules of engagement were liberated. Before long, atomic bombs and poison gas were the unpleasant necessities of war. But just 100 years earlier, conflicts with the exact same participants were far more limited. The Crimean War of the 18th century saw Russia battle both England and France. This was a conflict of multiple great powers, yet it was not an existential struggle to the death. In London and Paris, the streets bustled as usual, while military setbacks might end careers, not a nation's way of life. In a similar vein, the Mexican-American War offers another example. Yes, this conflict was undeniably important. It's historically significant. But the war was hardly total. No, these were limited conflicts, limited in aims, limited in means, limited in resources. In history, most wars fall into this category. After all, European kings were more often focused on specific duchies or domains than the systematic destruction of the opposing realm by arming every peasant possible. Now, academics have long waged their own battle over the concept of total war. The idea has its theoretical shortcomings, and conflicts seldom fall into a binary category. For example, London's colonial conquests might have been limited for the English, but for their tribal opponents, the war was probably quite total. Nonetheless, I believe that the ideas of total war does have some utility, especially when trying to understand the relative importance and difference of conflicts. Moreover, it is of great use when discussing the stunning military transformations of one era in particular, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. There is no shortage of historians willing to assert that the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras represent the first total war. After all, how else do you explain the sudden and dramatic transformation of warfare? In the years prior to the Revolution, battles rarely involved more than 100,000 combatants. By 1813, the Battle of Leipzig saw 150,000 casualties, with more than 500,000 soldiers. Furthermore, throughout the entire Napoleonic period, it's possible that the death toll amongst France's young men was proportionately higher than that of World War I. With such unprecedented scale, I would argue that the Napoleonic campaigns were certainly total in numerous dimensions. But some 20 years prior, the French Revolutionary Wars were no less limited. Indeed, it is only because of this earlier conflict that the size and scope of the Napoleonic era exists at all. Not only did the Revolutionary Wars provide the practical and theoretical foundations, but they also provide the opportunity. After all, if the Republic had been crushed in 1793, Napoleon would be a footnote in history, the Corsican who seized Toulon. Thus, it's here that we can return to the question that commenced the last episode. How did the French do it? Surrounded by enemies and besieged by internal foes, how did the young Republic survive and subsequently thrive? That is the question we will answer this episode as the National Convention embraces total war. One of the foremost scholars of total war theory is Stig Förster. A military historian, Förster proposed 4 elements in which to evaluate the totality of a conflict: total mobilization, total methods, total aims, and total control. Other specialists have formulated their own definitions and evaluations, but as we examine the Revolutionary War, we'll continue to reference these 4 pillars: mobilization, methods, aims, and control. In doing so, we'll be able to see the dramatic departure from historical norms. Given that total mobilization is itself one of Förster's 4 elements, it perhaps makes sense to commence with recruitment and conscription. As discussed in the last episode, by mid-1793, the Republic had a serious shortage of men. Death, desertion, and disease had of course taken their toll, while emigration had decimated the officer corps and some foreign regiments. But, perhaps most importantly, the pre-war recruitment efforts of 1791 had been undone by the end of the Belgium campaign. When National Guardsmen had joined the so-called volunteer battalions, the terms and conditions were clear: one campaign. With the winter of 1792-93, the roads swelled with French veterans making their way home. Thus, by the campaign season of 1793, the Republic was desperate for men. Furthermore, the situation proceeded to get worse. Firstly, the Allies soon launched a devastating counterattack, reclaiming Belgium and triggering Dumouriez's attempted coup. Morale was now in the toilet, and stemming desertion is a little difficult when your own commanders are preaching treason. Secondly, the Republic was then invaded again. The Austrians and the British attacked the northern frontier, while Prussian reclamation of the Rhineland was sure to be followed by an incursion into eastern France. Finally, previous recruitment efforts had produced mixed results. In February 1793, the convention had announced a levy of 300,000 men, hoping to give Dumouriez the troops he desperately required. Instead, that levy took months to produce half that number, while recruitment riots broke out across the country. Indeed, the Vendée was provoked into outright insurrection, forcing the enlistment of yet more men. So, if one of the key reasons historians regard the Revolutionary Wars as a total war is the successful effort to mobilize the population en masse, how exactly did the convention transform their previously patchy results? To begin with, it's worth noting that in old regime France, recruitment was no less difficult. Poor conditions, pay, and possibilities for advancement created a general perception that the army was best avoided. Indeed, local communities were often resentful of disruptive troops, while social stigmas discouraged enlistment. However, the advent of the revolution created new possibilities. This not only included fresh openings in the officer corps for those of common ancestry, but also the National Guard. Initially created as a revolutionary militia, service in the Guard was sexy. Wealthier active citizens flocked to its ranks, and the patriotic militia became one of the most visible and celebrated aspects of the revolutionary regime. From the festivals of federation to a host of official ceremonies, the Guard was routinely championed, even led by a host of prominent revolutionaries. The enthusiastic uptake of this new revolutionary militia prompted questions for the National Assembly. While the Assembly chose not to make dramatic changes to the army, there were some pushing major reforms. One such deputy was Dubois-Crunset, who we briefly met at the siege of Federalist Lyon in 1793. Back in 1789, the former officer was already advocating the transformation of the army. For Dubois-Crunset, the revolution presented a fantastic opportunity. Proclaiming that every citizen must be a soldier, and every soldier a citizen, Dubois-Crunset proposed the creation of a new national force. This reserve would consist of 1.2 million men, and its intimidating potential would ensure peace through strength. Critically, this citizen army would be full of conscripts, not volunteers. Furthermore, the force would be nationalised to ensure loyalty to the state and the revolution. This was a big departure from the norm, where regiments were often tied to specific regions or commanders, complete with bespoke uniforms and customs. Yet, while the need for the revolutionary army was clear to Dubois-Crunset, the National Assembly disagreed. Deputies were divided over the role of the armed forces in the new regime, with many suspicious of anything that increased the perceived power of the Royal Army. Thus, most substantial reforms were largely put on the back burner. Critically, the Assembly did not endorse Dubois-Crunset's proposal for conscription. Yes, citizenship implied duties and obligations, but the state would not resort to forced enlistment. Well, not yet. Deprived of attention which it desperately required, the regular army withered away. Increasingly, emigration gutted the officer corps, while insubordination of common soldiers spurred mutinies across the country. Yet, as desertion sapped the strength of the Royal Army, the National Guard continued to buck the trend. Nowhere is this seen more clearly than in the nation's road to war. In March 1791, the risk of conflict was on the rise. Emigre armies marshalled along the Rhine, while foreign monarchs warned of intervention. In such circumstances, the National Assembly commenced the revolution's first attempt at mass recruitment. Importantly, these efforts not only sought to bolster the traditional armed forces, but create something entirely new. The result was the so-called volunteer battalions. These units were completely separate from the regular army, composed of volunteers rather than common soldiers. The source of the recruits was the National Guard, and the creation of the volunteer battalions had major consequences. On the plus side, these volunteer battalions were embraced with national enthusiasm. Some recruiting officers were overwhelmed with applicants as revolutionary fever spurred men into action. Soon, the nation had drafted more than 100,000 men, a considerable achievement for the new regime. Interestingly, the demographics of these volunteers were quite different from the regular troops. Almost 80% of the initial volunteers were under the age of 25, and most had been members of the National Guard. With the Guard limited to wealthier active citizens, the resulting volunteer battalions were comparatively literate, educated, and committed to the revolution's principles. For those deputies who had opposed forced conscription, the abundance of these eager citizen soldiers seemed to have vindicated their position. Yet there were some unintended consequences of this new bourgeois army, to use the term of one historian. Firstly, National Guardsmen had elected their own officers, and the practice was maintained. The result was leadership that could be less than ideal. While some had military experience, others were just popular or well-connected, not necessarily those suitable for the task. Secondly, the volunteers were better paid compared to the regular soldiers, and simply enjoyed a superior lifestyle. Unlike the traditional army, communities celebrated these patriotic heroes, while their status as volunteers ensured greater freedoms and provisions. Consequently, resentment and friction was fostered between volunteers and common soldiers, hampering military effectiveness thanks to rivalries and disputes. Finally, it must be noted that these volunteers were just that, volunteers. They did not have military training, nor did they intend to forge a career in the army. These naive and green recruits would serve for one campaign, meaning that those fortunate enough to learn the art of war would soon be free to return to their former professions. However, despite the disadvantages of the volunteer battalions, the new recruits provided a much-needed influx of troops. Additionally, more was soon needed, as the outbreak of war had not gone to plan. With the Prussians invading France in mid-1792, the French scrambled for men. Eager to halt the enemy, the Legislative Assembly declared the nation to be in danger, and tens of thousands of volunteers were successfully raised. Unbelievably, this new citizen army promptly expelled the Prussians and scored unimaginable success. But come 1793, we hit the manpower problems we've previously discussed. With Dumouriez's successful conquest of Belgium, as well as advances into the Rhineland and Piedmont Sardinia, the volunteers had fulfilled their obligation to serve one campaign. Already desperate for men at a time when the volunteers could legally retire, it's here that we get the convention's February levy of 300,000 recruits. You know, the one that only manages to raise 150,000 and creates a host of new problems thanks to triggering the rebellion in the Vendée. Now, what I want to focus on here is not so much the mixed results of this initiative, but the unexpected and, to be frank, hilarious ways that this levy actually functioned. Even in February 1793, the convention was not yet ready to formally embrace conscription. Functionally, however, this was a sort of conscription, as each department would be required to make up the difference if its volunteers did not meet the required quota. Now, one of Foerster's 4 elements of total war is total mobilization, but another is total control. However, while the convention was slowly embracing the necessity of full mobilization, it was not yet dictating or controlling how it occurred. Instead, each department, and thus each individual commune, was pretty much left to its own devices. The result was creative shenanigans as people sought to avoid the draft. In many communities, citizens simply got together and voted on how they would select their unenthusiastic volunteers. Sometimes this resulted in the simple drawing of lots, where chance decided who marched to the front lines. But, though this might seem fair, even such random recruitment could cause serious disturbances. To understand why, we must talk about replacement. In short, replacement was the process where a wealthy man paid another to take his place. The practice was highly controversial in an era which prized equality, as it provided a means for the well-to-do to avoid their duties as a citizen. At times, entire communities would collectively pool funds to fill much of their quota through replacements, often purchasing poorer volunteers from nearby towns. The practice was so widespread that historian Alan Forrest notes that in some departments, replacements could make up a quarter of new recruits. However, in addition to being a disgraceful dereliction of duty, replacements had practical drawbacks as well. The influential deputy, Lazare Carnot, the so-called organizer of victory, made the following criticisms. In the sacred land of liberty, in that very country where the rights of man have just been sanctioned, a commerce in human beings is carried on. An infamous agent approaches a young peasant or a worker and says to him, "Do you want to sell yourself for the contingent?" Suddenly, there is 300 livres. The deal is made. Some men have the habit of selling themselves like cattle. They make a trade of deserting 5 or 6 times from successive battalions, and able-bodied men, designated to serve, get themselves replaced by the lame, the dissolute, and the vicious. But while the practice of replacement raised questions of effectiveness and equality, in other communities, any notion of fairness was dispensed with altogether. Instead of using chance to conscript volunteers, locals simply got together and openly voted for those who should be enlisted. To say that again, communities openly voted on those who should be conscripted. Now, I want you to take a moment to think about the various ways this system could be corrupted, from settling petty grievances to ridding yourself of your annoying neighbours. This democratic process was ripe for unethical abuse. And that's precisely what occurred. Having gone down the rabbit hole on this, there's no shortage of instances where groups of citizens got together and essentially voted out the people they liked least. In one case, a local community decided that the best way to save the revolution was to volunteer the local Jacobins for the war effort. Thus, these revolutionary enthusiasts were nominated to fulfill the Commune's conscription quota, despite the fact that these volunteers were wholly inappropriate choices. The Jacobin mayor was 45. The Jacobin procurer was 51. Both were twice the age as the average volunteer from 1791. In another instance, a community elected their constitutional priest to fight for the revolution, perhaps a rebuke that the cleric had not fought harder for true Catholics. Of course, the reverse could also occur. In some scenarios, communities forced enlistment upon those suspected of royalist sympathies. Here, former nobles were disproportionately selected as a means to rid the town of potential spies and traitors. The fact that these enemies could potentially do more damage in the army was seemingly ignored. Now, before we move on, I just have to digress. As we go through this episode and the next, you're going to see how the Revolutionary Wars acts as a bridge from old methods of warfare, which we don't recognise, to the type of modern warfare that we're familiar with today. This includes mass mobilisation and conscription, but it also includes propaganda campaigns, industrialised supply chains, promotions based on merit, and a range of other things. But I want you to entertain the idea of what conscription might look like in our own times, if these ad hoc methods still existed. I mean, could you imagine just how insane this would be? Your nation is at war. Your neighbourhood must nominate new recruits, and your neighbour Barry is just a bit annoying. He plays loud music in the middle of the night. He's always filling your trash cans with junk. He's been a right pain with the council, constantly objecting to you building your long-desired garden shed. Well, perhaps Barry would best serve the country on the front lines. Indeed, think of the petty grievances that could finally be settled using this method. Tiger mums who think that a teacher is erroneously holding back their little superstar? Well, goodbye, Mr. Woods. That plumber who definitely ripped you off last summer. Goodbye, Dr. Drain. Alternatively, imagine if in the Vietnam War, instead of lottery conscription, American towns just got together to vote out the most annoying neighbour. It would be madness. Now, to digress from my digression, the question I would love to answer is how often people tried to actually justify their nominations, or if this was just like shameless self-interest. You know, if you're trying to get rid of your neighbour Barry and send him off to Vietnam, are you up there at your town hall being like, well, Barry loves Vietnamese food, and so I think he would make a great ambassador and really win the hearts and minds of the locals. You know, were French citizens in the 1790s standing up and saying, well, my arch-rival happens to speak 2 words of German, and so I think he would be of great use to the war effort. That's what I want to know. Anyway, I just think this whole thing is absolutely nuts. Amazing, but nuts. To finish with some dark humour, if your family and friends had to band together to nominate a neighbour for conscription, who are you choosing and why? That can be today's conversation prompt for the dinner table or water cooler conversation with colleagues. Grim, yes, I know, but historically it's an important question to ask. Anyway, I've well and truly digressed. So, by mid-1793, it was clear that the convention's recruitment efforts were coming up short. Invaded on multiple fronts, and with the Federalist revolts breaking out across the country, the convention needed even more men. Desperate to fill the ranks, some representatives on mission started to go rogue. Preempting reforms from the capital, these deputies began to unilaterally declare total mobilization. Often assigned to frontier departments, these independent actions resulted in yet more ad hoc recruitment drives, each with their own terms regarding qualifications, exemptions, and processes. Interestingly, some deputies added a class lens to their efforts, specifically trying to conscript wealthier citizens instead of poorer farm workers. But the point here is that some departments were receiving orders to mobilize all men who met certain requirements, such as age and marital status. Occurring alongside these regional, isolated instances of total mobilization was the growing importance of Paris's ultra-radicals. In August, the Albertists were on the rise in the wake of Marat's assassination, but the enraged were not yet silenced. After the loss of the sieges of Mainz, Condé and Valenciennes, both ultra-radical groups were demanding a new mass uprising to repel the invaders. Joining them were delegates from across the country who had assembled in Paris in early August to formally celebrate the new Constitution. Theoretically, this proposed national insurrection would see every sans-culotte march in the defence of the Republic. These citizen soldiers would liberate the nation and defeat tyranny and despotism. But if this sounds familiar, that's because such words were once thoroughly Girondin. Although the purged deputies were now awaiting their trial, their Albertist detractors had usurped them as the champions of revolutionary war. Clearly, the radical Jacobins were suffering from amnesia, as ultras even predicted that this mass uprising would result in a short and easy campaign. However, the demands of Parisian ultra-radicals presented problems. Even some of their own, like Chaumet, wondered how to arm and supply such a large number of men when the existing armies were woefully under-provisioned. Others questioned the merits of hastily assembling unskilled recruits, while Robespierre and many deputies feared such risings would merely facilitate anarchy. Yet, as we've seen previously, the summer and autumn of 1793 was defined by consistent policy victories for the extremists. Just as the convention eventually folded on everything from price maximums to the arrest of all suspects, mass mobilization would be another victory. Facing considerable pressure, the convention needed to craft a response which met both military and political requirements. To do so, the deputies turned to one man in particular, the famed organiser of victory, Lazare Carnot. Known for his leadership on military matters throughout the Jacobin era, Lazare Carnot is one of the most powerful, interesting and surprisingly uncontroversial players of the time. Largely distant from political matters, the former engineer became the Committee of Public Safety's chief expert in the armed forces. As such, history knows him as the organiser of victory, and Carnot's name is one that we will hear repeatedly over the next few episodes. Aged 39 at the start of 1793, Carnot was elevated to the Committee of Public Safety in August. His elevation was in direct response to France's worsening military situation, and his first task on the committee was the issue of conscription. The task was simple. How could the government meet the political demands of a mass rising in a manner that was actually helpful? The result was the famous levée en masse, a truly radical and historic moment. This mass levy is considered by some historians to be a critical step towards universal conscription, as the French nation would theoretically mobilise every citizen. Every man, every woman, every child. As I read the following decree, I want you to keep in mind the sheer scale of its reach, in harnessing the potential of the entire Republic, in total mobilization some historians see a key justification for labelling the revolutionary struggle as Europe's first total war. From this moment, and until all enemies are driven from the territory of the Republic, all French persons are placed in permanent requisition for the service of the armies. The young men will go to battle. Married men will forge arms and transport supplies. Women will make tents and clothing and serve in the hospitals. Children will shred old linen. Old men will have themselves carried to public places to arouse the courage of warriors, preach hatred of kings, and unity of the Republic. Going on to specify the terms of the conscription, this permanent requisition of all French persons was a historic moment. While the decree had its failings and its limitations, what we have here is a key bridge to modern warfare. Indeed, this mass levée was a prelude to the mass mobilisations of the 20th century, and a foundational framework for the more immediate conscriptions which powered the Napoleonic Empire. Furthermore, we see here a state exerting its right to enlist every citizen, a requisition unprecedented in scale in European history. With the French pursuing the total mobilisation of the nation, at least rhetorically, historian Timothy Tackett claims that France had embarked on the first great effort of total war. Now, as with all pivotal moments in great conflicts, myth and reality are often intertwined. While theoretically all French citizens were requisitioned for the army, the truth was less grandiose. For example, women and children were seldom forced into national service, and I can't speak as to how often old men were taken to local squares to preach the hatred of kings. More importantly, only a fraction of eligible men were actually enlisted, with the new recruits totaling about 300,000. True, that expanded the French army significantly, perhaps by 50 to 60%, bringing the total number of soldiers to more than 750,000. However, the levy raised less recruits than the convention's own estimates, and it was hardly the national mass uprising envisioned by radical Jacobins. Likewise, with the levée en masse praised by contemporaries and some historians as instrumental in saving the Republic, there are those who consider it overhyped. Military historian Harold Blanton, for example, notes the armies created by the levy were unsustainably large and lost almost as many battles as they won. Historian David Bell, an expert in this era, asserts that the new recruits helped the French war effort much less than contemporaries claimed. Nonetheless, while I agree that the rhetoric exceeded reality, disputes arising from the levy's much idolised importance shouldn't overshadow its undeniable innovations. The magnitude of this effort was still astonishing, and historian Peter McPhee remarks that this was an unprecedented case of the people under arms. While scholars will continue to debate the levy's true impact, it is undoubtedly a component of the Republic's survival. With their enemies divided, the French could rely on sheer numbers to push the invaders back. However, as the convention pursued total mobilization, it should be noted that we have a second element of Foerster's 4 pillars of total war. While the deputies did not dictate every aspect of the levy, they did dramatically centralize and streamline mobilization policies. In other words, we see a growing willingness for an increasingly powerful central government to exert total control of the war effort. Going forward, qualification for enlistment was standardized, commencing with single men aged 18 to 25. The practice of purchasing replacements and public nominations was explicitly forbidden, and processes were established for marshalling and arming the recruits, which were chosen by random lottery. Overseeing this was the convention's own members, the representatives on mission. These deputies, stationed across the country, would ensure that men were only summoned when regional supplies were adequate, mitigating logistical concerns. Finally, in another nod to the increasing totality of warfare, the terms of service had changed. Gone was the stipulation that these recruits would only fight for one campaign. Instead, citizens would remain soldiers for however long was necessary. Yet, before we move on to discuss the convention's innovations in propaganda, I would point out that there is still much to discuss with the famous levée and masse. For example, there are the numerous and creative ways that men dodge the draft, such as marrying your 80-year-old neighbour knowing that the revolution's new divorce laws wouldn't make it permanent. Then there's the harsh measures employed to stifle any opposition, with the convention determined to avoid a repeat of the Vendéan insurrection. Moreover, I also want to touch on criticisms of historians, as some scholars are keen to point out inequitable outcomes of this supposedly equitable levy. So, to ensure that this episode didn't just become about conscription, I have saved these fascinating experiences and debates for the episode extra titled To Enlist or Resist. Make sure not to miss it. And since we're about to talk about propaganda, this seems the perfect moment to remind you that I need your support. This podcast, this revolution, is only possible thanks to the amazing people keeping Grey History on the air. If you're enjoying the show, please support the podcast and enjoy all the amazing perks. From indulging in hours of exclusive bonus content to avoiding mid-episode interruptions like this one, there's plenty of benefits to joining the Grey History community. So please, for a small contribution of a coffee or two a month, support the show today at patreon.com. I look forward to welcoming you personally. Now, the convention's total mobilization of the French nation was a major undertaking, one unprecedented in scale. For comparison, the mighty armies of Louis XIV numbered perhaps as few as 300,000 men. 100 years later, the convention was raising that total from just a single levy, in addition to other levies that year, and its already sizable armed forces. In such circumstances, the French required a complete overhaul of military affairs, from tactics to supplies to the army's own leadership. But while this unprecedented mobilization presented a variety of challenges, the revolutionaries faced a very specific and novel problem. As hundreds of thousands marched into camps across the country, how could the Republic turn citizens into soldiers? For traditional military men like Lazare Carnot, the value of propaganda was clear. The nation had enlisted peasants, artisans and shopkeepers, but what it required was soldiers. More specifically, the convention required men who would do as they're told. Fight when told to fight. March when told to march. Shoot when told to shoot. To achieve this, the government needed to maintain morale, promote unity, and instill discipline through idealized notions of soldiering in a war for universal liberty. Moreover, sustained propaganda could reduce desertion, insubordination, and a host of other threats which were no less perilous than the enemy. In short, if the Republic was to be victorious and the levée and masse successful, the government had to indoctrinate its citizens to create citizen soldiers. But here's where things become a little convoluted. For much of 1793, Carnot and the broader Committee of Public Safety did not have unrivaled control of the armies. Furthermore, As we've seen previously, the Jacobins in various halls of power rarely saw eye to eye. Unsurprisingly, military matters were no less contentious, and those with no military experience were not deterred from voicing their opinions. As such, disputes arose as to the purpose of the army, its leadership, its tactics, and indeed the role of propaganda. For men like Carnot, propaganda was a tool to ensure the government controlled an effective and disciplined fighting force. For others, it was something else entirely. If one were to leave the Committee of Public Safety and wander over to the Paris Commune or the War Ministry, one would find two powerful institutions full of abertists. These ultra-radicals had become the champions of total war, and their vision for the Republic's armies was thoroughly revolutionary. For men like journalist Jacques Hébert, the primary purpose of propaganda was political education. With thousands of young men snatched from their homes, the army offered an unprecedented opportunity for revolutionary indoctrination. Here, the revolution could create a revolutionary soldier, one that upheld the revolution's values. These men would not only export these ideals across the frontier, but reinforce them in their own communities once peace had been achieved. Moreover, if the army could be revolutionized, or perhaps more accurately, Jacobinized, then the ultra-radicals of Paris would secure a powerful political ally. As they battled with moderate Jacobins in the capital, soldiers could become the champions and enforcers of radical policies. As such, while Carnot was concerned about discipline and control, ultra-radicals in Paris, including in the War Ministry, were focused on political education and activism. Of course, the two objectives could be completely contradictory. If Carnot wanted an army that followed orders, the abertists wanted an army that would follow Jacobin principles. Indeed, from their perspective, it could do nothing else. For example, what if the Jacobins were removed from power? An army that was insufficiently Jacobin would simply follow the new regime and betray the revolution. Furthermore, what if a general, a new Caesar, usurped the power of the army? It would not be discipline that saved liberty, but the Jacobin hearts and minds of his defiant troops. Put simply, if Carnot wanted to transform citizens into soldiers, the ultra-radicals wanted to transform soldiers into sans-culottes. Historian Alan Forrest observes the conflicting agenda of various government institutions as it relates to revolutionary propaganda. What did the government intend to achieve through the political education of the armies? Was it primarily concerned with control and discipline, with ensuring that the military restricted themselves to executing the wishes of the political arm? Or was it seen in more ideological terms, as the active encouragement of political activism among those who were to fight in the name of the revolution? These were quite distinct and different aims. It is even arguable that they were incompatible, the one leading to a force of soldiers who accepted the political will of others and carried out their orders loyally and promptly, the other producing an army of committed republicans, of men who had thought about politics and who were ideologically bound to their government and its principles. The first option would result in an army which understood its duty to the state, an army which could be relied upon to support any regime without question. The second, in the context of 1793, would produce an army of committed Jacobins, reading newspapers and political speeches, following events in Paris, and fighting less out of duty than out of commitment. It would be a truly revolutionary army, fighting with all the passions the term implied. But for the leaders of the revolution, it would always contain an element of threat. The threat that comes from armed men imbued with a sense of mission, risking their lives for a cause. The army's support for every twist in revolution, any policy, and for each succeeding regime in Paris was not something that could be taken for granted. So, what we have in 1793 is two different visions for revolutionary propaganda, with the Republic's officials possessing separate agendas in educating soldiers. These currents could be complementary, but also contradictory. Keep that in mind, as we're about to see examples of one office actively sabotaging that of another. Now, there is a variety of ways that the government harnessed propaganda to instill discipline and revolutionary values. There's songs, theatres, festivals, uniforms, and iconography, just to name a few. But the most famous example of the government's innovative efforts to educate its citizen soldiers was the mass production of newspapers. Indeed, it's estimated that by mid-1794, more than 7 million newspapers had been sent to the front lines. To say that this was yet another unprecedented aspect of an increasingly modern style of warfare is an understatement. The scale was unheard of, although the exact level of readership is difficult to know. For example, one copy could be read, or at least listened to, by multiple men, meaning that the true reach of millions of papers is impossible to ascertain. Critically, of the various papers distributed, the most iconic is one we already know, Le Pierre du Chêne. The work of the prominent ultra-radical Jacques Hébert, his gritty sans-culotte character was a hit with the troops. Cursing and abrasive, Hébert's work was unapologetically radical, one that deliberately attempted to radicalise the army. Hébert advocated terror, strict economic controls, anti-clerical policies, and removal of those officials insufficiently revolutionary. He also engaged in military matters, such as demanding the purge of aristocratic officers. These demands had considerable consequences, and they helped to lead to the execution of almost 100 officers in various political show trials. However, what is of interest to me, and what will be critical in the future, is the financial benefits of Hébert's popularity. Remember, the War Ministry was staffed with like-minded ultra-radicals, and the contracts to purchase and distribute Le Père Duchesne were quite profitable. In ordering roughly 1.8 million copies, the ministry paid Hébert more than 100,000 livres. Of course, we have already seen Hébert and others denounce the Girondins for self-interested corruption. Unsurprisingly, however, it seems that securing government posts for allies was different from spending government funds on fantastic editorial work. To digress for a moment, I can't help but point out the difference here between Jacques Hébert and Thomas Paine, both French revolutionaries. Back in the American Revolution, the most popular pamphlet was Paine's Common Sense. But Paine did not profit from its sale, choosing to instead focus on promoting the cause. Years later, Hébert did nothing of the sort, and yet in late 1793, it was Paine who was in a dungeon. Arrested for his ties to the purged Girondin deputies, Hébert profited handsomely while his forerunner languished. On the bright side, Paine would miraculously survive the revolution, while Hébert would not. But before we discuss the innovative role of theatres, songs, and other mediums, the distribution of newspapers offers a fantastic example as to how competing revolutionary forces could contradict each other's work. In addition to public newspapers from Paris, military papers were also established. Most were produced for just a single army, and their contents and quality relied heavily on local patronage. Unlike Hébert's work, these military papers tended to focus more on the traditional priorities of the army. They sought to boost morale, dismiss rumours, and inform the men of glorious victories in the noble struggle. Yes, there was undoubtedly political and Jacobin elements to these papers, but their purpose was also to reinforce the leadership and control of the central authorities. Interestingly, in mid-1794, Carnot would attempt to innovate on these papers and introduce a national publication. Borrowing straight from Hebert, Carnot and his writers used the voice of an imaginary figure, this time a retired soldier. Here, this relatable one-eyed veteran who loved a drink rejected the distractions of political activism for simple patriotism, courage, and loyalty. These were the essential qualities of the French soldier, at least according to Carnot. Yet, these competing missions of political education could and did clash. As Carnot actively tried to shield the army from political activism, some ultra-radicals openly accused him of sheltering aristocratic officers. To be clear, these denunciations of a member of the Committee of Public Safety were occurring in the very press the soldiers were reading. The risk of mutinies or insubordination was not negligible, and this presents the very real dangers of the competing agendas of various Jacobin officials engaged in military matters. Thankfully, Robespierre and Billaud-Varenne intervened on Carnot's behalf, ensuring the organiser of victory could continue to organise that victory. But such attacks did go the other way. Some military commanders attempted to suppress the distribution of radical papers, while Carnot would later use his publications to denounce the dangers of ultra-radicalism and obsessions with political matters. Furthermore, after the fall of Robespierre, Carnot would use these papers to maintain the centralised control of the army, despite the removal of the nation's most iconic Jacobin. However, while we've only discussed the distribution of newspapers, they do offer a convenient way to see the scale, innovations, and shortcomings of propaganda in the Revolutionary War. 7 million papers was simply unprecedented, and they undeniably promoted key elements of total war. They encouraged full mobilisation, they expanded the government's control, they advanced the cause of total victory and the total methods required to annihilate the enemy. But for all their benefits, newspapers were hardly the only means in which the Republic created an army of citizen soldiers. There were songs, theatres, festivals, and a range of other mediums. Yet, like the levée and masse, I could have created an entire episode just on propaganda. The details are simply fascinating. For example, France's national anthem, some 200 years later, has its origins in the war songs of the era. Likewise, other initiatives like festivals were elaborate and grand, but also potentially troublesome. Turns out that if you attempt to replace Christian ideals with temples of reason, the common soldier who was regularly braving death might not actually be a fan of such godless innovations. Moreover, while theatre could be used as a method to keep the troops out of trouble, some representatives on mission saw it as an aristocratic indulgence worthy of exemplary punishment. So, in the second episode extra for this episode, we're going to run through the intriguing use and consequences of songs, theatres, and festivals. We'll also touch on iconography and how historians consider the importance and effectiveness of these propaganda efforts. Now, I might not be a one-eyed veteran soldier, but I am a veteran podcaster, and I assure you that you don't want to miss this episode extra titled Stagecraft for Statecraft. As a reminder, you can enjoy this and hours of other fantastic and exclusive bonus content by donating a coffee or two a month to keep Grey History going. Support the show today at patreon.com And if you're not able to do so, then please help the podcast by propagating the message and sharing the show with friends and family. Now, as the Republic rapidly assembled its new citizen soldiers, the demands of total war necessitated further innovations. Masses of untrained troops could not use traditional tactics, while the aristocratic officer corps was depleted from both emigration and execution. If the French army was to achieve victory, if the Republic was to survive, then this revolution in warfare could not stop here. Instead, a complete transformation of leadership and strategy was what the moment required. The process would be bloody. Thank you for listening to episode 87, Total War. Don't miss the 2 fantastic episode extras, To Enlist and Resist, and Stagecraft for Statecraft. From marrying grandmas to avoid conscription to unusual use of unorthodox propaganda, there's plenty to sink your teeth into. To access this and other amazing bonus content, support the show today at patreon.com. You can cancel any time, and for the price of just a coffee or 2 a month, there's no better value on the internet. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. Stay safe and have a great day. Grey History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Joining these fabulous heroes are the fantastic champions of the people: Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan, Danny, Gordon, Matthew, and Sophia.